There's a moment in every emotionally confusing connection where you start asking yourself the same question over and over again. Do they care? Or am I just imagining it? And the hardest part is they don't leave completely. They don't stay fully either. They exist in between, close enough to feel like something is there, but distant enough to make you question everything. But here's what most people never realize. Avoidants don't move toward you because everything is perfect. They don't suddenly become consistent because they've figured love out. They cross that line, the line they normally never cross, only when something inside them shifts. And that shift is fear, not fear of love, but fear of loss. Because when an avoidant starts to feel that you might actually slip away, something changes in their emotional system. Suddenly, distance doesn't feel safe anymore. Silence doesn't feel in control anymore. And the comfort of I can come back whenever I want starts to disappear. That's when you see behavior you've never seen before. They reach out when they usually wouldn't. They open up when they normally shut down. They try to stay connected even when it clearly makes them uncomfortable. But here's the truth that hurts the most. It's not always love that pushes them forward. It's loss, because avoidants are not driven by constant emotional closeness. They're driven by emotional awareness, the moment they realize something is slipping away that still matters to them. And that creates a contradiction. They don't want to be overwhelmed, but they also don't want to lose you. So they step forward, but only as much as their fear forces them to. Not enough to fully secure you, but enough to keep you from disappearing. And that's where people get stuck. They confuse fear-based pursuit with emotional availability. They think maybe they're changing, when in reality, they're reacting, not transforming, because once the fear settles, they often return to their distance again, unless something deeper has truly shifted inside them. So the real question is not, do they come closer when they're afraid to lose me? The real question is, do I want to live in a connection where I only receive effort when I start walking away? Because love that only activates at the edge of loss is not the same as love that stays present in calm. And your heart deserves more than being someone's emergency response to absence. It deserves consistency. It deserves presence. Avoidants don't shift their behavior just because a connection feels good, stable, or emotionally fulfilling. In fact, when things are calm and predictable, they often feel the least pressure to change. Comfort, for most people, strengthens connection, but for an avoidant, too much emotional stability can ironically activate their need for distance. Not because they don't appreciate it, but because emotional closeness, when sustained, begins to feel like responsibility. And responsibility in their internal world is closely tied to pressure. When everything is going well, there is no urgency forcing them to confront their emotional patterns. They can enjoy the connection on their terms, engaging when they feel like it, pulling back when they need space, and maintaining just enough presence to keep things alive. This manageable closeness to keep things alive. This manageable closeness becomes their comfort zone. It allows them to experience intimacy without fully stepping into vulnerability. And as long as the situation remains predictable and non-demanding, there is little internal motivation for change. But this creates a misunderstanding for the other person. Because from the outside, things can look promising. There are good moments, genuine chemistry, and sometimes even emotional depth. It can feel like progress, yet internally, nothing fundamentally shifts for the avoidant unless something disrupts that balance. Emotional safety for them is not always about closeness, it's about control. And when control is intact, there is often no reason for them to adjust their behavior. That's why they don't typically wake up to love just because someone treats them well or understands them deeply. Understanding alone doesn't always challenge their internal defenses. In fact, it can sometimes make them more comfortable staying exactly where they are. Because they know the connection is safe, they know the person is available, and they know they don't have to risk much to maintain it. So the system stays unchanged. Real change in their behavior usually begins when something disturbs that sense of emotional predictability. Not in a dramatic or chaotic way, but in a way that introduces uncertainty. When they start to sense that access to you is not guaranteed anymore, or that the emotional dynamic is no longer entirely under their control, something shifts inside them. That's when the connection becomes real in a different sense, not just emotionally enjoyable, but emotionally at risk. And this is where many people misinterpret the situation. They assume that if the avoidant is still around, still talking, still engaging at times, then things must be developing. But presence alone is not the same as emotional movement. Someone can remain in your life while still avoiding deeper investment. They can care in their own way without stepping into consistency or vulnerability. So the key truth is this: avoidants don't transform in comfort. They don't suddenly become more open because they feel understood or safe. In many cases, comfort actually allows avoidance to continue unnoticed. Change usually starts only when emotional certainty is disrupted, when they realize that staying the same might cost them something they didn't fully value until it felt uncertain. Avoidants don't suddenly move closer just because someone becomes available, loving, or emotionally consistent. Their system doesn't respond strongly to comfort alone. Instead, what creates movement in them is the emotional shock of potential loss, the realization that something they assumed would always be there might not be there anymore. That's the moment where their internal balance starts to shift. Not because they suddenly discovered love, but because they sensed absence where presence used to be. For an avoidant, emotional distance is not always about lack of care. It's about maintaining control over connection. When they feel they can come and go without consequences, they stay relaxed in that pattern. They might check in, respond when convenient, and keep a low-level connection alive without feeling pressured to deepen it. This creates a false sense of stability where everything feels fine, even if it lacks depth. But fine is often where they remain until something interrupts that emotional safety net. The turning point happens when that safety net starts to weaken, when your attention shifts, when your emotional availability decreases, or when they sense that you are no longer as emotionally reachable as before. Their internal world reacts, not always consciously, but instinctively. It creates a subtle alarm, not panic in the dramatic sense, but a quiet discomfort that says something is changing and I don't fully control it anymore. That discomfort is what pushes them toward action. Suddenly, they may reach out more frequently, initiate conversations, or show emotional openness that wasn't present before. To the other person, this can feel like breakthrough, like they are finally choosing closeness. But often, what's really happening is not a deep emotional transformation, but a response to perceived emotional distance. The shift is triggered by fear of loss, not a stable decision to fully engage. This is why their closeness can feel intense but temporary. When the fear of losing you is active, they step forward. When that fear calms down and they feel secure again, their system tends to revert back to distance. It becomes a cycle of approach and withdrawal driven less by consistent emotional growth and more by fluctuating internal security. What makes this dynamic so confusing is that the moments of closeness are real, but they are not always anchored in long-term emotional change. They are anchored in emotional reaction, and reaction is not the same as resolution. So while it may feel like progress when they come closer, the real question is whether that closeness remains when the fear fades. Because with avoidance, fear can open the door, but only emotional maturity and sustained vulnerability can keep them inside it. Avoidants are not primarily driven by constant emotional closeness in the way many people assume love works. For them, too much emotional intensity over a long period can actually trigger discomfort, even if they deeply care about the person involved. What they often struggle with is not connection itself, but the sustained experience of emotional closeness without breaks, without distance, and without the ability to retreat when things feel overwhelming. In their internal world, ear operates in a very specific way. There is the fear of emotional suffocation on one side and the fear of loss on the other. Most of the time, the fear of being overwhelmed keeps them at a distance. They regulate closeness by stepping back, creating space, and maintaining control over how deeply they engage. This allows them to feel safe because they are never fully exposed for too long. They can connect, but on their own emotional terms. However, when the possibility of losing someone important becomes real, a different kind of fear activates. It is not loud or dramatic, but it is powerful enough to interrupt their usual pattern. Suddenly, the comfort of distance is no longer as comforting because distance now carries a cost. What once felt like safety can begin to feel like disconnection. And in that moment, their priorities shift. Not because they have stopped fearing closeness, but because the fear of losing you starts to outweigh the fear of emotional intensity. This is why avoidance can appear inconsistent. When everything feels stable and secure, they naturally drift toward distance because that is their default regulation strategy. But when that stability is threatened, they move closer. Not always in a fully resolved or emotionally mature way, but enough to re-establish connection and reduce the discomfort of potential loss. It is a push-pull system driven by internal emotional recalibration rather than steady progression. The key misunderstanding here is assuming that their movement towards you always means readiness for deeper emotional connection. Sometimes it does, but often it simply means that the fear of separation has become stronger than the fear of intimacy. That creates urgency, not necessarily transformation. They reach out, they engage, they reappear, but the underlying emotional structure may remain unchanged. So, what looks like pursuit is often a reaction to imbalance. They are not always choosing closeness because they are fully comfortable with it, but because distance suddenly feels too uncertain. And once that uncertainty is resolved, the system may naturally settle back into its familiar pattern of emotional restraint. Understanding this helps reveal an important truth. With avoidance, movement towards you does not always equal emotional evolution. Sometimes it is simply the mind's way of restoring equilibrium when loss feels too close to accept. Avoidance can remain emotionally present in small ways without ever fully stepping into consistency or long-term commitment, and this is where many people become emotionally confused. From the outside, it can look like progress. They reply, they check in, they show interest in moments that matter. There are signs of connection enough to keep hope alive and enough to suggest that something is developing. But underneath that surface level engagement, the deeper pattern often remains unchanged unless something disrupts their emotional comfort zone. The key misunderstanding is assuming that presence always means progression. With avoidance, presence can sometimes simply mean maintenance. They are capable of staying in touch, being warm, and even sharing emotional moments without necessarily committing to deeper relational responsibility. This is because engagement at a manageable level allows them to keep the connection alive without triggering the discomfort that comes with full emotional exposure. They can participate without surrendering control. When things feel balanced and low pressure, they often remain in this space. They are not being pushed to define anything, and they are not experiencing emotional urgency. So the connection continues in a steady rhythm that feels active but not evolving. To the person on the receiving end, this can feel like stabby, litty, but in reality, it may be a form of emotional stalling, a space where nothing fully breaks, but nothing fully builds either. The challenge is that avoidants rarely stay in one emotional position permanently. Their behavior is often reactive to internal states rather than guided by consistent relational intent. So even if they are engaging today, that engagement is not always a guarantee of sustained emotional availability tomorrow. It depends on how safe or pressured they feel internally, not just on the strength of the connection itself. This is why inconsistency becomes such a defining feature. They may show up strongly when they feel a sense of emotional loss, then retreat when that pressure eases. They may open up in rare moments of vulnerability, then return to distance when things feel too emotionally intense again. It creates a pattern that feels unpredictable, but it is actually driven by a consistent internal rule. Stay connected as long as it feels safe, withdraw when it feels too exposing. And because of this, it becomes essential not to mistake emotional moments for emotional movement. A deep conversation does not always mean deeper commitment. A loving message does not always mean stable availability. With avoidance, the real measure is not how they show up occasionally, but whether they remain emotionally present, even when nothing is pushing them to do so. When an avoidant truly wants someone, the shift is rarely loud, dramatic, or perfectly consistent, but it is noticeable in one important way. They begin to tolerate discomfort for the sake of connection. This is the real difference, because under normal circumstances, Their system is designed to protect them from emotional intensity. Their default response to closeness is regulation through distance. But when someone becomes genuinely important to them, that pattern starts to bend, even if only slightly at first. You may notice they don't disappear as easily as they used to. Where they once pulled away quickly after emotional intensity, they now hesitate. There is a pause where distance used to be automatic. They may still feel the urge to withdraw, but something holds them in place just long enough to stay engaged. That hesitation is significant because it shows a conflict between their instinct and their desire. This is where their behavior becomes more layered. They might not suddenly become fully open or perfectly consistent, but they begin to make small compromises against their avoidance. They respond when it would be easier to disappear. They re-engage after moments of withdrawal. Instead of fully detaching, they stay in conversations that feel emotionally uncomfortable instead of escaping them immediately. These are not grand transformations, but they are meaningful deviations from their usual pattern. What makes this different from fear-based pursuit is that it starts to show continuity. It is not only happening when they feel you slipping away, it begins to appear even when things are relatively stable. That means their effort is not only reactive, but gradually becoming intentional. They are not just responding to loss, they are starting to choose presence, even in moments where distance would feel easier. However, this process is not linear. Avoidants don't suddenly become fully secure or emotionally fluent overnight. Even when they want someone deeply, they still oscillate between closeness and withdrawal. The difference is that the return becomes stronger, quicker, and more intentional over time. The connection doesn't disappear completely during their fearful moments. It stretches, but it doesn't break as easily. So when an avoidant truly wants you, you will not just see intensity, you will see endurance. Not perfect consistency, but repeat, never to come back. Not constant vulnerability, but growing willingness to stay present when vulnerability is uncomfortable. And that gradual shift from avoidance to engagement is what separates temporary fear-driven behavior from something that is beginning to turn into real emotional investment. When someone remains emotionally guarded, it creates a very specific kind of relationship dynamic. One that feels close on the surface but limited in depth. You may experience moments of connection, attraction, even emotional intensity, but there is always a ceiling you eventually bump into. That ceiling is their unwillingness or inability at that moment to fully step into vulnerability. And no matter how strong the connection feels, a guarded heart can only offer a guarded version of love. The most important thing to understand is that guardedness is not the absence of feeling. It is the regulation of feeling. Someone can care deeply, even intensely, but still choose not to fully express or act on that depth. They can enjoy your presence, miss you, think about you, and still keep a part of themselves protected. This creates a situation where you are not dealing with a lack of emotion, but a limitation in expression and consistency. Over time, this creates imbalance. One person is reaching for clarity, depth, and emotional certainty, while the other is managing closeness within strict internal boundaries. This is when confusion begins, because the connection is not empty, it is partially alive, but it is not fully available either. And that in-between space is often the hardest place to be, because it keeps hope alive while denying full fulfillment. A guarded avoidant may show you enough to keep the connection going, but not enough to make it feel secure. They might engage in meaningful moments, but hesitate when it comes to defining or deepening the bond. They may return after distance, but rarely in a way that fully resolves the emotional gap. This cycle can continue for a long time, especially if nothing disrupts it. And during that time, you may find yourself adapting, waiting, or lowering your expectations just to maintain connection. But the reality is simple. If someone remains guarded indefinitely, the relationship will always be limited by that guard. You cannot build full emotional intimacy on partial availability. You cannot create security with inconsistent openness. At some point, the emotional weight becomes uneven because one person is investing in potential while the other is managing protection. And this is where clarity becomes essential, because love is not meant to exist only in moments of emotional safety or selective vulnerability. It is meant to grow in consistency, in openness, and in mutual emotional risk. If that risk is only being taken by one side, then what you have is not a balanced connection. It is a connection still shaped by fear, not by shared emotional freedom. At the end of everything explored in this message, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Emotional connection is not proven in moments of intensity alone, but in what someone consistently chooses when things become real. Avoidants can feel deeply, they can care strongly, and they can even create powerful emotional moments. But the true measure of a relationship is not what happens in those peak moments. It is what remains when comfort fades and emotional responsibility begins. And that is where the real line is drawn. Throughout this dynamic, the confusion often comes from mixing emotional reaction with emotional readiness. When an avoidant moves closer, it can feel like progress, like change, like hope, finally turning into reality. But in many cases, that movement is not a full transformation. It is a response to internal discomfort, often triggered by fear of loss rather than sustained emotional openness. And while those moments of closeness can feel real, they are not always anchored in long-term consistency or vulnerability. What makes this pattern so emotionally powerful is its unpredictability. There are moments of warmth followed by distance, engagement followed by withdrawal, clarity followed by confusion. This cycle keeps hope alive because there is always enough connection to believe in, but never enough stability to fully relax into. And over time, this creates emotional tension where you are constantly trying to interpret meaning from behavior that is not always rooted in steady intention. But understanding this pattern is not about judging the other person. It is about seeing reality clearly. Avoidant behavior is often shaped by internal fear structures, not lack of worth or lack of feeling. However, understanding the why does not change the impact on you if your needs for consistency, clarity, and emotional safety are not being met. Compassion for someone's emotional limitations should never come at the cost of your own emotional well-being. So the final realization is this: love cannot exist in a space where only fear determines when someone shows up. If someone only crosses the line when they are afraid to lose you, then their connection is still being guided by absence, not presence. And what you deserve is not a love that appears when distance becomes threatening, but a love that chooses you even when distance is not forcing the decision. Thank you for taking the time to go through this message with depth and attention. Not everyone pauses long enough to reflect on emotional patterns, relationships, and their own inner world, but the fact that you did shows awareness and emotional maturity. If this speech resonated with you, don't just leave it here as words. Take the insight with you. Use it to see situations more clearly, to protect your emotional peace, and to choose connections that bring clarity instead of confusion. Understanding behavior is powerful, but applying that understanding in your own life is where real change begins. Remember, you don't need to chase clarity that should be given freely. You don't need to overthink silence that speaks for itself. And you don't need to stay in spaces where your emotional needs are constantly secondary. The right connection will not require you to decode it endlessly. It will feel steady, mutual, and real. Thank you once again for being here, for listening, and for engaging with this message all the way through. Take care of yourself, protect your peace, and never forget your worth is not measured by who stays confused about you, but by who chooses you clearly. Goodbye.